The night she told me to leave my own house, I stood frozen in the doorway, hearing words I never thought would be spoken under this roof. This was the place where I rocked my son to sleep, where my late husband's laughter still lived in the walls, where every corner held a memory stitched into my heart. My daughter-in-law didn't see any of that. To her, it was just a property to claim a stage for control. She had no idea the neighbors had already whispered about her midnight trips carrying my classic wedding dress and family photos to her car. She had no idea the deed still carried my name. And she had no idea that the same house she tried to push me out of would become the place where the truth finally broke her. The rain was coming down in sheets when I heard the knock at the door. It was the kind of storm that made the windows rattle and the lights flicker, the kind that seeped into your bones if you stood still long enough. I had been sitting in the darkened living room listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the steady thrum of the rain on the roof when the sound came. Slow, deliberate 3 knocks. I pushed myself up the wooden floor, cool under my bare feet, and walked to the front door. When I opened it, the porch light cut through the storm just enough for me to see my son. David stood there, soaked to the bone, hair plastered to his forehead, eyes hollow and red as if he hadn't slept in days. His clothes clung to him, his shoulders sagged under some invisible weight. Behind him, clutching her coat tight around her body, was Lena. Her makeup had smudged from the rain, but even then her chin lifted with a kind of defiance that didn't match the desperation in David's eyes. I didn't ask questions. I simply stepped aside and opened the door wider. David shuffled in first, dripping water onto the rug I had kept since he was a child. Lena followed, brushing past me without a word, and the scent of her perfume clashed with the damp smell of rain and cedar. David stood in the foyer, staring at the staircase as if it were a mountain he wasn't sure he could climb. I reached for him, touching his arm. His skin was cold. "You're freezing," I said softly. "Let me get you a towel." He shook his head, tried to speak, but his voice cracked. Lena set her bag down with a thud and finally broke the silence. "We need to stay here for a while," she said. Her tone was flat, more statement than request. I looked at David. His eyes darted to the floor. "What happened?" I asked, though I could already guess. His shoulders trembled. "I lost the job," he muttered. "I tried, Mom. I tried to make it work. They let me go last month." I swallowed the ache in my throat. The boy who once filled this house with laughter, who dreamed of building skyscrapers, was now standing in front of me like a man hollowed out. "And we got evicted this morning," Lena added, crossing her arms. "Landlord didn't care about excuses." I drew a slow breath, steadying myself. The storm outside rattled the windows. I wanted to gather David into my arms like when he was little, tell him everything would be all right, but the presence of his wife standing there with that cold gaze stopped me. "Let's get you dry first," I said. "We'll talk after." I led them into the living room. The lamp in the corner cast a soft glow on the familiar walls, the same walls I had painted with my late husband 30 years ago. David sank onto the couch, water dripping onto the fabric. Lena sat beside him but didn't touch him. I went upstairs, fetched towels, and when I returned, David rubbed his face hard as if he wanted to erase everything clinging to him. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered. I sat across from him, hands clasped tight in my lap. For a moment, the only sound was the rain pounding the roof. My mind kept drifting to the memories carved into this house. The Christmas mornings on that rug. The nights I stayed awake waiting for him to come home from high school games. My husband's voice echoing in these same rooms. And now my son returned broken, carrying a storm inside him heavier than the one outside. "Do you have a plan?" I asked gently. David's eyes welled, but he blinked hard. "I don't know. I just couldn't stay out there anymore." "We'll figure something out," I told him, though doubt curled in my stomach. Lena leaned forward, then her voice sharper. "We just need a place to stay until David gets back on his feet." "That's it." I held her gaze steady and calm, though my pulse quickened. This was my home, the last piece of stability I had, and I felt already how quickly it could shift under me. The clock ticked on the mantel. The storm eased to a steady drizzle, but the heaviness in the room didn't lift. David slumped further into the couch, eyes closed as if surrendering to exhaustion. Lena pulled the blanket over her shoulders, looking around the room with an expression I couldn't quite read. I rose slowly. "I'll make some tea," I said. "You both need warmth." In the kitchen, as I filled the kettle, I caught my reflection in the window. My face lined with years, eyes tired but fierce. The storm outside was nothing compared to what had just entered my home. When I returned with the tea, David was already asleep, his chest rising and falling unevenly. Lena took the cup from me without thanks. I sat back down, cradling my own cup, staring at the two of them, and I knew deep inside that this was only the beginning. I studied Lena more closely in the lamplight. Her nails were perfectly manicured despite the eviction she spoke of. A designer purse sat at her feet, rainwater dripping off the leather. It struck me that even in the middle of loss, she wanted to look untouched. She caught me looking and lifted her chin higher. "I'll help David," I said, my voice calm. "But this house has rules." Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "We'll see," she murmured. The words hung in the air, subtle but sharp, like a crack that begins small before spreading across glass. I turned my eyes to David, his face slack in sleep, and remembered another storm years ago when he was 10. The power had gone out and he had run to my room, terrified of the thunder. I had held him until he drifted off, promising that storms always pass. Tonight, I wasn't sure if that was still true. The rain slowed, leaving only the steady drip of water from their coats onto the rug. I fetched another blanket and draped it over David, tucking it around his shoulders. His breathing steadied. I stayed in the chair until the clock struck midnight. Lena's eyes finally closed, her head tilted back, but even in rest, her features looked rigid, unyielding. I set down my empty cup and listened to the silence that had settled. It wasn't the peace I once knew here. It was the kind of silence that weights heavy with what it knows is coming. And as I sat there in the dim glow of the lamp, I felt the truth settling in my bones. My son had come home, but not in the way I had ever wished. With him came a storm that no roof could keep out. And though the night was finally quiet, I understood that this was only the first crack of thunder. The kettle rattled faintly on the stove as steam hissed from its spout, but I hardly noticed. My eyes followed Lena as she walked slowly through the kitchen, touching the counter with a kind of appraising curiosity. She looked at the cupboards as though she were already measuring where her own dishes might go. I gripped the handle of my mug tighter, the warmth of the tea burning against my palm, trying to steady myself. David sat at the table, his hands wrapped around his own cup, shoulders hunched. His silence filled the room more than her voice did. "This place feels a little dated," Lena finally said, brushing her fingers along the wood paneling. "I know it holds memories for you, but maybe it could use a modern touch." Her tone was light, almost casual, but each word pierced me like a pin. I forced a smile that felt more like a grimace. "It has always suited us fine," I said, careful not to raise my voice. David shifted uncomfortably, looking between us as though he were caught in a storm he did not know how to calm. Lena's eyes landed on the rug under the table, the same one David had crawled across as a baby. She tilted her head. "This has seen better days. We could roll it up, maybe replace it with something brighter." My breath caught in my throat. That rug had been there for decades, its threads worn by years of footsteps, spills, and laughter. To her, it was a stain. To me, it was the ground where my son had grown. "David," I said quietly, "do you remember learning to walk on this rug? You fell so many times but always got back up." He looked down at it, and a faint smile tugged at his lips, a flicker of recognition that gave me a moment's relief. But Lena quickly placed a hand on his arm. "Change isn't bad," she said. "Sometimes you have to let go of the past to move forward." Her words sank like stones into the silence. I carried my cup to the sink and stared out the window. The yard stretched beyond the glass, the same oak tree standing tall where David once built forts with scraps of wood. Every corner of this place held a story. I could not imagine letting any of it slip away. Later that afternoon, I walked through the living room with a laundry basket. I stopped abruptly when I saw the photo of my late husband missing from the mantel. My chest tightened. The frame had always stood there beside the vase of lilies. I searched the shelves, the side table, even the box of old magazines stacked in the corner, but it was gone. Lena appeared in the doorway, drying her hands with a towel. "Looking for something?" "Where's the picture that was here?" I asked, my voice shaking. She shrugged. "It was old. The frame was chipped. I thought it made the room look cluttered." My hands gripped the basket so tightly the wicker pressed into my skin. "That picture has been here for 30 years. Well, maybe it's time for something new," she said with a shrug, as if the past could be discarded as easily as yesterday's newspaper. David came in then, sensing the tension. "Mom," he said softly, "please don't get upset. We just want things to feel fresh." I looked at him, at the boy who once cried when he lost a toy in the yard, the man who now stood by as his wife swept away his own history. My throat closed, but I managed to speak. "This house is not just furniture and frames," I whispered. "It is our life." That night, I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. The quiet felt heavier than usual. My mind kept replaying the empty mantel, the casual tone in Lena's voice. I pressed my hand against the quilt handmade by my grandmother, each patch stitched with care. The thought of it disappearing left me breathless. Days later, I noticed more changes. A small porcelain angel once perched by the window was gone. A quilt folded neatly on the couch had vanished. I searched the closets, the attic, but found nothing. When I asked David, he rubbed the back of his neck and avoided my gaze. "Maybe it's in storage, Mom." Lena thought we should declutter. Declutter. As if stripping away history was cleaning a shelf. I walked through each room slowly, my eyes scanning for what else had vanished. The living room felt thinner, lighter in the worst way. The weight of memories that once comforted me had been hollowed out. One evening, Lena brought home a shopping bag and spread glossy catalogs across the table. She pointed to couches, rugs, lamps. "Look at these, David," she said brightly. "Imagine how much better this place could look." He nodded faintly, his expression unreadable. I stood in the doorway, gripping the frame, fighting the urge to shout. Instead, I spoke calmly. "This house doesn't need to be remade. It needs to be respected." Lena looked up, her smile thin. "Respect works both ways, Anna. We live here too now." Her words struck like a slap. My jaw tightened, but I held my ground. "You are guests in this home," I said. "That means honoring what came before you." The air grew still. David frozen between us. Lena's eyes flashed, but she said nothing more. She gathered her catalogs and left the table. I sat down across from my son, my heart pounding. "David, do you remember the summer we painted this kitchen together, how we ended up with more paint on us than the walls?" He smiled faintly, the memory flickering back. "That's what this place is," I said softly. "Not walls to redecorate, but the story of who we are." He lowered his head, his fingers tightening around his glass of water. "I'm just trying to keep the peace, Mom. And I am trying to keep our family from disappearing," I whispered. The silence stretched long, filled only by the tick of the clock on the wall. I knew then that this was not just about furniture or decorations. It was about power, about who belonged, about whose voice would decide the future of the home that carried my entire life. That night as I walked up the stairs, I paused at the top and looked down the hall. The pencil marks of David's height still climbed the wall untouched for years. I traced them lightly with my fingertips, a vow forming in my chest. They would not take this from me, not while I still breathed. One afternoon, I opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed, the same one my mother had given me on my wedding day. The lid creaked softly, and for a moment I inhaled the faint scent of cedar that had clung to the wood for decades. My hands reached instinctively for the bundle of lace that should have been there, folded carefully in layers of tissue. The space was empty. The dress that had carried me down the aisle with Robert was gone. A cold rush spread through my chest. I rifled through the chest-lifting blankets and boxes, but the gown was not hidden underneath. My fingers trembled as I closed the lid, the hollow sound echoing through the room. I sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the quilt my mother had stitched by hand when I was a girl. The stitches were uneven in places, her fingerprints woven into the fabric. I pulled it closer to me as though holding it could stop the room from spinning. That evening at dinner, I looked at Lena across the table. Her nails gleamed under the light tapping against her glass. David cut his food without meeting my eyes. I wanted to ask her then to demand the truth, but my voice stuck. Instead, I folded the quilt and placed it at the back of my closet, hidden as if I could protect it. The next morning, I returned to check on it, needing reassurance, but the space was bare. My breath caught, and I pressed my palm against the wood of the shelf as if the missing quilt had left behind a wound. I searched the laundry, the linen closet, even the trunk in the attic. Nothing. Panic drove me to the living room where our wedding photo once hung above the mantel. The frame was gone, the bare wall glaring at me like a missing tooth. I staggered back, my heart hammering the emptiness of that wall louder than any shout. I stormed into the kitchen where Lena sat with her laptop open. The glow of the screen lit her face. I leaned closer and saw images of quilts, dresses, frames, each with a price tag. She closed the browser too quickly, snapping the lid shut. "Where are my things?" I demanded, my voice raw. She tilted her head, a faint smile on her lips. "What things, Anna?" "My dress. The quilt. The photo. Where are they?" She sighed, pushing her chair back. "They were old. Worn. I thought it would be better if someone else could use them." "You sold them," I whispered, hardly recognizing my own voice. David entered just then, his eyes darting between us. "What's going on?" "Your wife has been selling our family's history," I said, my hands shaking. Lena folded her arms. "I was decluttering. That dress was yellowed. The quilt was falling apart. The photo frame was chipped. Why should we keep junk around when we need the space?" My knees felt weak, but anger steadied me. "Junk!" I repeated, the word bitter in my mouth. Those were pieces of my life. David rubbed his temples, his voice quiet. "Lena, maybe you should have asked before," she cut him off sharply. "I was doing what's best for us. We're building a future, not living in the past." I turned to David, searching his face for some sign of resistance, some defense of what was ours. He looked away, silent, and the silence hurt worse than any words. That night I could not sleep. I wandered through the house, touching the places where my belongings had once been. The quilt's absence left the closet cold. The missing photo left the living room barren. I opened the cedar chest again, staring into the emptiness where my dress had rested. I pressed my hands against the wood, my tears soaking into my palms. Days passed, and each time I turned a corner, another object was gone. A porcelain figurine of a dancer I had bought at a fair with Robert vanished from the shelf. The brass clock from his office disappeared from the mantel. When I confronted Lena, she always had the same answer. Too old, too broken, too useless. I knew then I had to find proof. One afternoon when she left her laptop open, I scrolled quickly before she could return. My breath caught when I saw it. The quilt my quilt displayed on an online marketplace, its photo taken against the backdrop of my own living room floor. The caption read, "Hand-stitched vintage quilt, excellent condition, $200. My vision blurred with fury. I snapped the laptop shut just as I heard the door open. I stood there trembling when Lena walked in, her shopping bag swinging from her arms. "What are you doing?" she asked coolly. "Protecting what's mine." I said, my voice steady now, colder than I felt. She smirked. "Not for long." I turned and walked away before she could see the tears burning in my eyes. Upstairs, I pulled open drawers, cupboards, closets, desperate to salvage what remained. A box of letters Robert had written me in our first year of marriage was still tucked behind the sweaters, untouched. I clutched it to my chest, holding on to the last thread of memory she had not cut. Later that evening, David found me sitting on the edge of my bed with the box in my lap. His face looked weary, the lines of worry etched deep. "Mom," he said softly, "I know this is hard, but maybe Lena's right. Maybe we don't need so much stuff." I looked up at him, my voice breaking. "These aren't just things, David. They are us. They are your childhood, your father, our family. Once they're gone, you can't bring them back." For a moment he seemed to falter, his eyes softening, but then he looked away again. I could almost see the leash around his neck pulled tight by her hand. I said no more, but inside me, something hardened. Each loss had carved away at me, but now there was only steel. If Lena wanted war over memories, she would find I would not surrender. That night I locked the bedroom door, slid the box of letters beneath my bed, and pressed my hand flat against the floor. The wood felt solid, the house itself alive beneath me. They would not erase me. They could strip the walls empty, the shelves sell the past piece by piece, but they would never take the truth that still pulsed through these rooms. One morning I reached for the handle of the linen closet, and the knob wouldn't turn. I jiggled it once, then again harder this time, and realized a new lock had been installed. I stared at the shiny brass still smelling faintly of hardware oil, and my stomach sank. That closet had always held my spare sheets, my towels, the quilts my mother made. Now it was sealed off as if I were a stranger trespassing. I went to find Lena. She was in the living room rearranging the throw pillows and tapping something into her phone. "Why is there a lock on the closet?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked up, her expression flat. "Oh, that. I needed more space for our things. Some areas are private now." "Private?" The word cut into me. "This is my house. That closet has always been mine." Her eyes narrowed. "Not anymore. We need boundaries if we're going to live here together." Later that day, I tried to go into the guest room, the one where I used to store holiday decorations. A paper label had been taped across the door with neat block letters, "Private." My hand trembled as I ripped it down, but the door itself wouldn't open. A new lock gleamed at the knob, identical to the closet. When David came home that evening, I confronted him. "Did you know she put locks on the doors?" He hesitated, pulling off his jacket. "Lena thought it would help us stay organized." "Stay organized," I repeated bitterly. "David, I can't even get to my own linens." He avoided my eyes, setting his keys down on the counter. "Just talk to her, Mom." I laughed, then a short, bitter sound. Talk to her. As though my words had ever mattered in this house since she stepped inside. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen only to find Lena already there with a cup of coffee. She didn't look up as she said, "From now on, can you let us know if you're going to use the living room in the evenings? We want some privacy." I froze in the doorway. The living room? My living room. The place where David had taken his first steps, where Robert and I had sat every Christmas morning watching him tear open presents. Why would I need permission to use my own living room? I asked quietly. "Because it's our space now," she replied, sipping her coffee. The words struck me harder than any slap. Our space. She wasn't even pretending anymore. That night when I came down the stairs with a book in hand ready to sit in my armchair, I found her stretched out on the couch, her feet propped on the table. She didn't move. Instead, she looked at me and said calmly, "We'd appreciate if you could let us know before coming in." I stood frozen on the stairs, gripping the banister. "This is my house, Lena." She leaned forward, then her eyes sharp. "This is our house. You're just staying here." The room spun around me. I wanted to shout to throw her out into the night, but David came in at that moment. He saw us tension thick in the air and quickly said, "Can we not do this right now?" I swallowed my fury and turned away, climbing the stairs back to my room, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold the banister. Behind me, I heard Lena whisper something to him, her voice low but laced with triumph. Over the following days, the boundaries multiplied. A sticky note appeared on the refrigerator. "Please don't rearrange." The pantry shelves were reorganized with labels marked "Ours." Even the garage where Robert's old toolbox had sat for years now had a padlock on the cabinet. I felt myself shrinking inside my own walls, cornered into smaller and smaller spaces. I began spending long hours in my bedroom with the door shut, clutching the box of Robert's letters as though it were armor. At times I heard them laughing downstairs, the sound echoing up through the vents, reminding me of the distance that had grown between my son and me. One afternoon, I heard a drill buzzing from downstairs. I rushed down to find Lena at the door to Robert's study, the one place I had kept untouched since his passing. She was screwing a new lock into the frame. "Stop!" I shouted, the word tearing from me. "You will not touch this room!" She looked over her shoulder, cool as ever. "It's just another space we need." I stepped forward, my chest heaving. "If you lay one more hand on this room, Lena, I swear you will regret it." David appeared, then alarmed by my raised voice. "What's going on?" "Ask your wife," I snapped. "She's trying to shut me out of my own memories." Lena put the drill down slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. "I'm protecting our privacy," she said evenly. David stood between us, rubbing the back of his neck. "Maybe we should just leave the study alone," he murmured. For once, I saw a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, but she didn't back down. "Fine," she said finally. "But don't think this means you control everything." That night I sat at the kitchen table long after they had gone to bed. I looked around the room, tracing the lines of the cabinets Robert had built, the scratches on the table where David had done his homework as a boy. And I realized then that Lena's boundaries were not about organization or privacy. They were about erasing me wall by wall, door by door, until I was nothing but a guest in the place I had built. I pressed my palm flat against the table, feeling the grooves of wood beneath my skin. A quiet resolve grew inside me. She could put locks on every door, paste labels on every room, and claim it all as hers. But this house remembered me even if they tried to shut me out. I stood up, finally blew out the candle, and went to my room. The hallways seemed narrower, the walls pressing closer. But in the silence, I promised myself that I would not be erased. I went to bed that night with my chest tight, the silence of the house pressing down heavier than the quilt that no longer lay at the foot of my bed. I stared at the ceiling, hearing every tick of the old clock in the hallway, each one like a reminder that time and memory were slipping away piece by piece. When morning came, I forced myself up brewed coffee in the same kitchen where I used to hear Robert humming while he buttered toast, and tried to ground myself. But my eyes caught on the bare spaces that had started appearing like scars across the house. The wall above the mantel looked naked where our wedding photograph had hung for decades. At first, I told myself maybe it had been taken down for cleaning or reframing. But when I searched through the closets and the storage bins, it was nowhere. My hand lingered on the faint square of cleaner paint on the wall, and my stomach turned. That photo was more than paper and frame. It was a witness, a memory frozen in time, and now it was gone. I tried to ignore the unease, but days later, another discovery cut me deeper. Opening the cedar chest that had followed me from my parents' home to this one, I expected the faint smell of cedar and the sight of carefully folded fabric. Instead, I found only dust and the faint impression where the quilt once lay. My mother's hands had pieced that quilt together, stitching love into every seam, a gift she'd made for me the year Robert and I married. It had covered our bed for years, warmed David on sick nights, and even acted as a tent when he was a boy playing on the living room floor. Now gone. I sank onto the floor beside the chest, my hands clutching the empty lining. The ache in my throat swelled until I could barely breathe. Losing Robert had already hollowed me out, and now Lena was chiseling away at what little I had left to hold. It was Emily who put the final truth in front of me. She came over one Saturday, her dark hair tied back and her laptop tucked under her arm. "Aunt Anna, you need to see this," she said, her voice sharp. She pulled up an antique marketplace online and spun the screen toward me. There it was, a gold ring etched with ivy leaves sitting on a granite counter that looked sickeningly familiar. "That's my mother's ring," I whispered. Emily clicked through the seller's other listings. My quilt, Robert's pocket watch. Even a blurry image of that wedding photograph cropped so it looked like nothing more than a decorative frame. All of them up for sale. My hands trembled as I reached for the screen. Emily's jaw clenched. "She's selling your life." I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was there in bold print and bright pictures. My pulse hammered as anger surged through the fog of grief. That night I confronted David. He was sitting at the kitchen table staring into a cup of coffee like it held all the answers he refused to face. "David, I need you to listen." I showed him the listings, my finger jabbing at the pictures. "These are my things, our family's things. Lena is selling them." His shoulders slumped. His eyes flicked away. "Mom, you don't know that. Maybe those are similar items. Maybe you're overreacting." "Overreacting?" My voice cracked. "That's your grandmother's ring. That quilt your grandmother made for me. These aren't coincidences." He rubbed his forehead, his voice tired. "Even if she did, maybe she thought they were old, that you didn't care anymore. You keep too much stuff, Mom." I staggered back, wounded by his indifference. "Old too much stuff. These things were pieces of my soul. They were the story of this family. Later that evening, I found Lena in the hallway, her perfume wafting ahead of her like a warning. "Where is my mother's ring?" I demanded. She didn't blink. "I sold it." My throat closed, my fingers curled into fists. That ring was hers, passed to me, meant for Emily one day. Lena smirked, cool as glass. "Then you should have kept it locked up. Things have value, Anna. Better to turn them into money than let them rot in a drawer." Her words cut sharper than any knife. She brushed past me, her shoulder grazing mine, as if to remind me of her new dominance. I stood frozen, trembling, the hallway spinning. When I told Emily, her outrage was fire. "This isn't just cruel, it's theft. You need to fight back." Her conviction sparked something in me, but in the quiet of the night, the emptiness screamed louder. The mantle without the photo, the cedar chest without the quilt, the drawer without the ring. Each absence was a hole ripped open, and the house itself seemed to sag under the weight of what was missing. Neighbors began to glance my way differently. Mrs. Gray lingered near her mailbox, her lips pressed tight with sympathy she didn't dare voice. Humiliation burned hot in my chest. The whispers were beginning, I knew it. But beneath the shame, another force stirred. A fire that had long been dimmed. This wasn't about objects. This was about my history, my roots, my right to exist in the house I had built, loved, and fought for. Lena wanted to erase me, to replace me, to make sure when people walked these rooms they saw only her handprint. I couldn't let that happen. That night, as rain tapped against the windows, I lay in bed with Emily's voice echoing in my head. "We'll find a way. We'll make her pay for this." For the first time in weeks, I felt the faintest thread of resolve knitting itself together inside me. Lena thought she was clever, that she could chip away at me piece by piece. But she didn't understand the weight of memory, the stubborn roots that ran deeper than any price tag. By dawn, the decision had hardened in me like stone. This was no longer about survival. This was war, and I would not lose. "Mrs." Gray stopped me near the hedge one afternoon, her hand hovering over her mail, as if she were deciding whether to speak. She leaned in, her voice low. "Anna, I don't want to stir trouble, but I've seen Lena carrying boxes out to her car late at night. More than once. Big boxes." She looked around nervously before adding, "It didn't seem like trash." Her words pierced through me like a blade. I thanked her quietly, keeping my face calm, though my heart had already begun to pound. As soon as I stepped back inside, I pressed my palms against the kitchen counter to steady myself. So it was true. The missing things hadn't just vanished. They were being moved, hidden, siphoned away in the dark. That night I didn't sleep. I stayed by the upstairs window, the lights off my body, still as a shadow. Around midnight, the faint beam of headlights cut across the driveway. I saw Lena, her coat pulled tight, balancing a cardboard box against her hip. She glanced over her shoulder before sliding the box into the trunk of her SUV. My chest tightened as I pressed my hand to the cold glass. I waited until the sound of the engine faded before slipping on my jacket. My hand shook as I grabbed my keys. I hadn't trailed anyone since my teenage years, when my friends and I spied on crushes from the back of a pickup. But tonight was no game. I eased my old sedan onto the street, headlights off, until I was half a block away. The town was quiet, only the occasional flicker of neon from the 24-hour diner. Lena drove with a strange purpose, taking turns like she had rehearsed them. I followed at a distance, keeping my heart from leaping into my throat each time she slowed at a stop sign. Finally, she pulled into a row of storage units on the edge of town, their dull metal doors lined up like soldiers in the dark. I parked down the street, killing my lights. From my seat, I watched as she unlocked one of the units, the rusted door screeching open. The fluorescent bulbs flickered to life inside, spilling a pale light over stacks of boxes. She carried the one from her car inside, disappearing into the clutter. Even from where I sat, I could see the shapes of furniture picture frames leaning against the wall, the outline of an old cedar chest. My cedar chest. The breath rushed out of me, ragged and hot. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. There it was. The truth laid bare under a buzzing bulb. Lena hadn't been redecorating or cleaning out. She had been stripping me piece by piece, hiding the bones of my life where she thought I'd never look. I forced myself to wait until she shut the door and drove off. Only then did I step into the cool night air, my shoes crunching against the gravel as I walked closer. I pressed my hand against the locked unit door, my chest aching as if I could feel the heartbeat of everything she had stolen behind it. The next morning, I confided in Emily. Her eyes flashed with anger, her fingers flying over her phone as she searched. "Aunt Anna, if we can prove those are yours, we can stop her. We can document this." Her determination gave me a strange mix of comfort and dread, but David was harder. I tried to tell him about what I had seen about the storage unit filled with our past. He rubbed his temples, looking at me like I was unraveling. "Mom, you're making this into a conspiracy. Lena's just trying to make room. You hoard things." The word stung worse than any slap. Hoard. Those weren't junk piles. They were heirlooms, the threads of our family story. I wanted to scream, but the hollowness in his eyes silenced me. For days, I moved in a haze, my body going through motions while my mind circled back to the metal door on the edge of town. I began to take long drives, pretending to run errands, but always ending near the storage lot, parking far away and staring at that row of units. Sometimes I saw Lena's SUV. Sometimes I saw nothing. But I knew what waited inside, and the knowledge burned in me like acid. One evening, I caught her in the act again. She was dragging what looked like an old trunk from the back of her car. Even from my hiding place, I recognized the brass fittings. Robert's military footlocker. I had kept it in the basement, filled with letters, medals, and photographs that told the story of his service. My throat closed. That wasn't hers to touch. When she drove away, I walked to the edge of the fence, gripping the chain link until it rattled. A storm was gathering, clouds rolling heavy above. The air smelled of rain, and the first drops tapped against my skin. I stood there long after she was gone, soaked, but rooted in the realization that Lena wasn't just rearranging or even selling. She was erasing. The following Sunday, Mrs. Gray caught my arm again. She said softly, "I thought you should know I saw her loading something that looked like a quilt into her car." I swallowed hard, nodding as if I hadn't already known. Her eyes were kind but filled with pity, and I hated the feeling of being pitied. That night, Emily and I sat side by side at my dining table, the glow of her laptop illuminating the darkened room. She showed me listings tied to the same seller account. More pieces. More history carved up and priced out for strangers to claim. I clenched my jaw, staring at the screen until the images blurred. "She can't just get away with this," Emily said. And I heard myself answer, steady and low, "No, she won't." The house was silent around us, but inside me a storm had already begun. For the first time since Robert's passing, I felt something stronger than grief. It was fury, sharp and clean, and it told me one truth that pulsed in my bones. Lena thought she had hidden her crime behind a locked door, but I had seen it, and now I would never unsee it. That Sunday afternoon, the house was filled with the clatter of dishes and the faint hum of conversation as I set the table. I laid out the old china patterned with blue roses, the set Robert and I had bought from a little shop in Savannah 40 years ago. Each plate, each fork seemed like a soldier lined up for battle. I moved slower than usual, aware that this dinner was no ordinary gathering. My heart pressed against my ribs with the uneasy rhythm of anticipation. Paul arrived first, his arms full with a casserole dish, his wife right behind him carrying a basket of bread. Emily followed, her laughter ringing bright, cutting through the tension that clung to the air. They hugged me warmly, whispering that everything smelled wonderful, but their eyes flicked upstairs toward the closed bedroom door. Even before Lena descended, they sensed the storm waiting there. When David and Lena finally came down, he looked weary, his smile weak while she was polished as always, every step in those pointed heels, sharp against the wooden stairs. She greeted everyone with the ease of a hostess in her own home, not a guest under my roof. That small detail set my teeth on edge. We sat down passing dishes, exchanging polite words. For a brief time, it felt almost normal, like the family dinners we used to have. Paul told a story from the hardware store. Emily joked about her professor's laughter rippled lightly across the table. I let myself breathe, grateful for a sliver of peace. Then Lena placed her fork down with a deliberate clink. The sound cut through conversation like a blade. She folded her napkin neatly, her eyes scanning the table as if preparing to deliver a speech. She began talking about family balance, about how young couples need space to grow, about how clutter and nostalgia could weigh people down. Her voice was smooth, but her meaning sharpened with every word. Then she turned to me, her smile brittle, and suggested perhaps I might think about finding a smaller place more suited to my age, somewhere easier, somewhere that would allow David and her to make this house their own. The room froze. Paul's fork hovered midair. Emily's cheeks flamed red. David stared down at his plate, his knuckles white around his glass. My stomach clenched, the words echoing in my ears like thunder. I asked her quietly if she truly believed I did not belong here. She lifted her chin and replied that boundaries were necessary, that clinging to the past could poison the future. And then, in a voice firm enough to still the air, she declared this was their house now, and I was only staying here. The silence that followed was suffocating. My breath felt heavy in my chest. Paul cleared his throat. His wife shifted uncomfortably, and Emily whispered under her breath that it was not fair. Still, no one directly challenged Lena. The weight of her words pressed down on me until I thought my heart might burst. But instead of breaking, something in me hardened. My hands steadied, my pulse slowed, and I rose from my chair. I walked to the cabinet, opened the drawer, and retrieved the folder I had placed there days ago. Returning to the table, I set it down firmly and pulled out the deed. The county seal gleamed faintly under the chandelier light. My voice did not tremble when I said this house had been purchased by Robert and me, that it bore our names, not hers. This was not a matter of clutter or nostalgia. It was truth written and recorded. Emily leaned forward wide-eyed, her lips parting in surprise. Paul gave a small nod, relief flickering across his features. David looked cornered, glancing helplessly between Lena and the paper in front of him. Lena's expression froze into something cold, her jaw tightening. She said deeds were just pieces of paper, that love and progress mattered more than ink and signatures. Her voice rose sharp and controlled, echoing in the high ceilings. I answered that love did not mean erasing history. Love did not mean selling quilts sewn by my mother or pawning photographs that carried generations. Love did not mean stripping me of dignity in my own home. My words cut through the air, steady and unshaken. For the first time, I saw doubt flicker in her eyes, but it vanished quickly as she leaned back, lips curved into a thin smile. "If you want to drag this into something legal," she said, "then do it. But you cannot stop us from living our lives. The world moves forward with or without you." I closed the folder, slowly sliding the deed back inside. My voice was low, but it carried weight when I said this was not about holding anyone back. It was about protecting what was rightfully mine. Then, almost as an afterthought, but pointed enough to sting, I mentioned I knew about late-night trips about things leaving this house when no one was supposed to notice. Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of panic quickly masked by a tight smile. She asked lightly what I was implying. I did not answer. The silence was more powerful than words. After that, the dinner unraveled. Conversation limped along, forced and hollow. Paul tried to change the subject, asking Emily about her classes, but his voice lacked conviction. Emily pushed food around her plate, barely touching it, her eyes flashing anger at Lena. The roasted chicken cooled, untouched, the casserole congealed in its dish. Dessert was refused by all. The air was too thick, too heavy with unspoken tension. When the time came to leave, hugs were quick, words clipped. Emily clung to me for a moment longer, whispering that she believed me, that she saw what was happening. Paul met my eyes with quiet support, but said nothing aloud. The door shut behind them, and the house felt colder than the November night outside. Upstairs, David trudged off, muttering about exhaustion, while Lena's heels struck the stairs like gavel blows before the bedroom door slammed shut. I stayed at the table alone, folding the linen napkins with slow, deliberate care, smoothing out wrinkles as though the act could mend what had been fractured tonight. The folder with the deed sat beside me, its weight heavier than stone. I knew this battle was far from finished. Tonight had been only the beginning, a warning, and Lena now understood I would not quietly disappear. The house was silent for almost a day after the dinner fell apart, silence that pressed into my chest until I could hardly breathe. I tried to keep myself busy by sweeping the kitchen, folding laundry, polishing the banister, but the image of Lena's sharp smile and the fury in her eyes lingered like smoke. David barely spoke, moving around the house, like a shadow leaving before dawn and returning long after dark. I knew something would break soon, though I did not know how quickly it would come. It happened on a Tuesday evening when the air outside carried the first bite of winter. I had retreated to the den with a book, hoping for a sliver of quiet, when the heavy slam of the front door jolted me upright. Voices rose quickly, David's low and pleading, Lena's high and cutting. I closed my book, walked toward the noise, and paused just inside the hallway. Lena stood in the living room, her coat still on her phone, clutched tightly in her hand. David tried to reason with her, but she cut him off, her words slicing through the air. She said she had had enough of being disrespected in her own home, and that she was going to put an end to it right now. Her eyes flicked toward me, burning with defiance as she dialed. The call was short. She told the operator that there was a dispute, that she felt unsafe, that she needed officers to come immediately. My heart pounded as I leaned against the wall, a strange mix of dread and anger twisting inside me. David whispered something to her, but she waved him away, pacing like a cat preparing to pounce. Minutes later, the red and blue lights flashed through the front windows, washing the living room in color. Tires crunched on the gravel drive, and then came the knock at the door, heavy and firm. Lena rushed to open it, her voice pitched high with urgency as she explained her version before the officers had even stepped inside. 2 uniformed men entered their presence, filling the small space with authority. One of them asked calmly what seemed to be the problem. Lena gestured toward me, accusing me of refusing to leave, of creating tension, of clinging to property that was not truly mine. Her words poured out in a rush, painting herself as the victim of an unreasonable woman. I stood straighter, my hands folded, waiting for my turn. When the officer finally turned to me, his expression neutral, I explained that this was my home, purchased with my late husband, our names etched on the deed. I told him calmly that I had not threatened anyone, that I had simply been defending what belonged to me. He listened carefully, scribbling notes, then exchanged a glance with his partner. They asked to see documentation, and I retrieved the folder from the cabinet, setting it on the coffee table with deliberate care. The officer flipped through the papers, nodding slowly. After several long minutes, he looked up and explained in an even voice that this was not a criminal matter, but a civil dispute. He said no one here had committed a crime that would justify removal or arrest. He repeated the phrase more than once, making sure both sides understood. He told Lena that calling the police could not change ownership or force me out, and he advised that if she wished to pursue her claims, she would need to do so in court. His partner added that their role was limited to ensuring peace tonight. They would file a report, but the resolution had to come through legal channels. Lena's face flushed scarlet, her jaw tight. She argued that she felt unsafe, that my presence was unbearable. The officer remained unmoved. He said plainly that discomfort did not equal danger and that no law had been broken. David finally spoke, then his voice rough with embarrassment, telling them he wanted no trouble, that he only wished for calm. The officers nodded, handed us a copy of their report number, and then left as swiftly as they had come. The sound of the patrol car pulling away left the house hollow once again. I turned back to Lena, who glared at me with a hatred so sharp it nearly stole my breath. She hissed that this was not over, that I would regret humiliating her like this. David stood between us, rubbing his temples, looking older than his years. I said nothing more that night, only gathered the papers and returned them to their place. My hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the certainty that I had crossed an invisible line. The battle was now fully out in the open. Later, in the quiet of my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the weight of the evening settle over me. The officers had been clear. This was a civil issue, one that needed the courts. For the first time in months, I felt a strange flicker of clarity. The rules were not vague. The law was on my side if I was brave enough to invoke it. The thought steadied me even as exhaustion tugged at my limbs. The next morning, I called Laura, an old friend from church who had become a respected attorney downtown. My voice trembled slightly as I told her what had happened, how the officers had come, how Lena had tried to twist the truth. Laura listened patiently, then said in her firm, steady tone that it was time to make things official. She explained the process of filing for legal protection of my rights, the possibility of an injunction, the steps needed to secure what was already mine. Each word she spoke lit a small fire in me, a flame that had nearly gone out under months of humiliation. I agreed to meet her later in the week, and when I hung up the phone, I felt both heavier and lighter. Heavier because the road ahead would not be simple, lighter because at last there was a path forward. In the kitchen, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, the rich scent filling the air, and for the first time in a long while the house seemed to exhale with me. Yet I knew the reprieve was temporary. Upstairs, I could hear Lena's sharp voice on another call, her words muffled, but her anger unmistakable. She would not surrender easily. Neither would I. That night, as I sat in the den with the deed resting on my lap, I traced the embossed seal with my fingertip and whispered to myself that I would not let Robert's legacy be stolen in silence. The papers were more than ink. They were the story of a life built with love and sacrifice, and now they would be my shield in the storm that was only beginning to gather. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, a mix that brought back memories of PTA meetings and small-town ceremonies, not battles that could decide the course of a life. I sat at the long oak bench beside Laura, my lawyer, and anchor my palms pressed flat against my skirt to keep them from trembling. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting pale stripes across the room, and I tried to steady my breath as the bailiff called the session to order. Lena sat across the aisle with her own attorney, her posture rigid, her chin lifted as if she were entering a fashion show rather than a courtroom. David was behind her, hunched in his chair, looking worn and lost his tie, crooked his eyes never meeting mine. I wanted to reach for him to remind him of the boy who once held my hand on the way to school, but that time was gone. The judge entered robed and solemn, and everyone rose before sitting again in silence. Laura rose first, her voice clear as she outlined our case. She spoke of the deed of the decades I had lived in that house of my husband Robert, and the life we had built brick by brick. She moved with practiced calm, her hand gesturing lightly to the folder of documents laid before her. When she submitted them as evidence, the clerk stamped them with finality, and I felt a small current of relief. Then she called Mrs. Gray. My neighbor walked carefully to the stand, her hair tucked beneath a neat hat, her hands folded tightly around her purse. She testified to what she had seen, how Lena had carried boxes into her car late at night, how she had noticed familiar items leaving the house one by one. Her voice was steady, her eyes sharp, and I felt gratitude swell in my chest. Next came Emily, my niece, who explained how she had tracked the missing heirlooms online. She described the quilt, the wedding photograph, the ring, each listed for sale under a name that traced back to Lena. The judge leaned forward, listening carefully, and the courtroom grew taut with silence. Emily's words were like pins puncturing a balloon, letting out the false air Lena had filled the room with. When it was Lena's turn, her lawyer tried to shift the narrative. He argued that Lena had only been helping to declutter, that she believed she had David's approval, that her intentions were misunderstood. He painted me as stubborn, clinging to the past, refusing to move forward. Lena herself finally took the stand, her voice sharp and defensive, her gaze darting from the judge to the gallery. She claimed the house was hers by right of marriage, that I was only prolonging an inevitable transition, that I had no respect for her role as David's wife. Laura stood again, calm but unyielding, and cross-examined her. She asked Lena why she had sold items under an alias if she had nothing to hide. She pressed her on why the deed bore only Robert's and my names. Lena faltered, then her words catching her face tightening as she realized each question was a step deeper into a trap she had set for herself. She lashed out, raising her voice, accusing me of manipulation, of turning everyone against her. The judge's gavel struck once sharp and final, ordering her to compose herself. I watched it unfold with a strange mix of sorrow and vindication. Part of me ached that it had come to this, that family had been dragged into the public square, but another part of me felt the heavy chains around my heart begin to loosen. For months I had been silent, humiliated, cornered in my own home. Now here in this room, the truth was finally given voice. The proceedings stretched on each exhibit, displayed, each testimony weighed. Laura guided it with precision like a conductor leading an orchestra. When she delivered her closing statement, she spoke not of property, but of legacy, of respect for the past, of the sacredness of a home built on a marriage. Her words filled the chamber, weaving together the documents, the witnesses, the history into a fabric no one could deny. The judge sat in silence for a long moment after his eyes on the papers before him. The weight of the room pressed down on all of us. Finally, he cleared his throat and delivered his ruling. The house, he said, was legally and rightfully mine. The evidence was undeniable. Lena had no claim of ownership, no standing to remove me, no right to dispose of the possessions. His voice was firm, each word a stone laid into the foundation of justice. The gavel struck again, and in that sound I felt years of fear, grief, and helplessness lift. My eyes stung, but I refused to let tears fall in front of Lena. Across the aisle she sat frozen, her mouth slightly open, her attorney whispering urgently to her. David closed his eyes and rubbed his forehead, his shoulders slumping as if the last of his defenses had crumbled. Laura squeezed my hand once quietly, not for show but for strength. I whispered a thank you, my voice barely audible, and gathered my papers with deliberate care. As we rose to leave, I felt the air in the courthouse shift, as if something that had been tightly wound had finally snapped free. When I stepped outside into the crisp daylight, the sky felt wider, cleaner, as though the world had exhaled with me. The courthouse steps stretched down to the street where traffic moved steadily, life going on as it always had. But for me, everything was different. I had fought for my home, and I had won. I paused on the steps, closed my eyes for a moment, and let the sun touch my face. Behind me, I could still hear Lena's voice rising angry and broken, but it no longer pierced me the way it once had. The judgment was clear, the law was on my side, and for the first time in a long while, I felt steady enough to face whatever came next. The judgment spread faster than I imagined, carried through neighbors' whispers, church pew chatter, and eventually the town paper. By the weekend, everyone seemed to know the house was mine, and that Lena had been caught trying to strip it bare. Some spoke in hushed voices, others in frank tones that carried across grocery aisles. I overheard one woman say she always knew something was off about Lena, that she dressed too sharp for someone supposedly building a new life from scratch. On Monday morning, a letter slid under the front door. It was addressed to Lena from the corporate office of the insurance firm where she had been working. She must have opened it in the kitchen because I heard the paper tear, then silence, then the crash of a glass shattering in the sink. I walked in cautiously, and there she was gripping the letter with white knuckles, her eyes wide. She had been dismissed effective immediately. They cited conduct unbecoming damaging to the company's reputation. She spun on me, her face flushed. "This is your fault. You ruined me. You think winning in court wasn't enough, now you want to destroy my career too." Her voice was sharp enough to cut, but I stood still, hands resting against the back of a chair. I didn't answer. There was nothing to say. She stormed past me, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. That afternoon, I sat with Mrs. Gray on her porch. She poured me iced tea and shook her head. Folks like her, she whispered, they build themselves up on other people's foundations, but once the cracks show, the whole thing comes down. I nodded, grateful for her plain wisdom. Watching Lena unravel felt unsettling, not triumphant. It was as if justice had shifted into consequence, and now it was no longer in my hands. The next days were filled with tension. Lena rarely came downstairs, and when she did, her movements were erratic, slamming cabinets, muttering under her breath. David, however, began to move differently. He wasn't avoiding me as much, though he still kept a careful distance. I caught him lingering in the hallway outside Robert's old study, his eyes scanning the framed photographs on the wall. One evening he paused in front of the picture of him at 6 years old, holding up the baseball he had hit over the neighbor's fence. His lips parted slightly as though he might speak, but then he walked away. It was Emily who told me that Chris had reached out to David. They had stayed in touch loosely over the years, and Chris had heard about the trial from his college roommate who lived in town. Apparently, he had called David to check in, and David had actually answered. The next night, I heard David on the phone in the den, his voice low, hesitant, but not angry. A softness I had not heard in a long time crept back into his tone. The following week, I found him sitting at the kitchen table with a notepad. His handwriting was shaky but familiar. When I asked if he wanted coffee, he shook his head and said quietly, "I have an appointment tomorrow with Chris for counseling." The words hung in the air, heavy but promising. I wanted to hug him to tell him how proud I was, but I only nodded and squeezed his shoulder lightly. He didn't need my celebration, only my steady presence. When he returned from that first session, his face looked drawn, but his eyes held something new, something searching. He didn't share details, and I didn't pry. Instead, I made a pot of chicken soup, the kind he loved as a boy, and left it warming on the stove. He came in later, filled a bowl, and ate in silence. Halfway through, he said, "It felt strange talking out loud about everything, but it also felt like breathing for the first time in months." The rhythm of the house shifted again. Lena grew more isolated, spending nights at her sister's place on the other side of town. David, on the other hand, began walking outside in the evenings, sometimes with Chris, sometimes alone. I watched from the porch as he moved through the yard, his shoulders less hunched, his steps steadier. He stopped once by the old oak tree, placing his palm against the bark as though grounding himself. One night after returning from a session, he sat across from me in the living room. "Mom," he began, his voice breaking slightly. I didn't want to see it. I thought if I kept going along, it would all sort itself out. But I see now she's been twisting everything, making me believe I owed her more than myself. Tears slipped down my cheeks before I could stop them. I reached for his hand, and for the first time in years, he didn't pull away. He let me hold it, let the silence between us do the work words couldn't. By then, the town had mostly moved on, but I could feel the undercurrent. People stopped me in the market to squeeze my arm to say they were glad the truth had come out. A few even offered to help if I needed anything. Justice had its ripple effects. Lena was seen less and less, and when she did appear, heads turned. She walked fast, eyes fixed on the ground as though outrunning whispers she couldn't silence. One afternoon, David came back from therapy and set his keys on the counter. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "I don't know what the future looks like, but I can't keep living like before. I need to find myself again." I nodded, heart tight, but hopeful. He didn't need my map, only my belief that he could find his own. That night, as I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs, the house felt different. The walls seemed lighter, the air less heavy. It was still bruised by what had happened, but it was beginning to heal just like my son. I paused at the top of the landing, listening to the quiet. For the first time in a long while, it was not suffocating but calm, and I realized then that the house had done what it was always meant to do. It had held us through storms, it had anchored us when we lost our way, and now it was teaching us how to begin again. The key turned stiffly in the metal door, the scrape echoing down the quiet row of storage units. Emily stood beside me, her hand gripping my arm, her breath puffing in little clouds in the cool morning air. When the lock finally gave way, I pulled the door up slowly, the rattle of steel lifting to reveal rows of boxes stacked unevenly and covered in dust. The smell hit me first, musty cardboard, and something faintly familiar like cedar mixed with lavender sachets that had long lost their strength. For a moment, I couldn't move. My chest tightened as though stepping into a tomb where parts of my life had been buried. Emily slipped her phone from her pocket and flicked on the flashlight. The beam fell on a wooden chest shoved in the back, the same one Robert had built the summer after we were married. My knees almost buckled. We stepped inside, careful between the clutter. I knelt before the chest, brushing dust from its lid, my fingers trembling. The lock was cheap, newly bought, and with a quick twist of a small crowbar Emily had borrowed from Chris's garage, it snapped open. The lid creaked as it lifted, and there they were. My wedding album, its leather cover worn smooth from decades of hands turning pages. The quilt my mother had stitched the year David was born, folded carefully yet cruelly hidden. An old jewelry box with the initials of my grandmother etched into brass. I pressed the album to my chest, closing my eyes as tears stung. Emily crouched beside me, resting her hand gently on my shoulder. "Grandma, it's all here," she whispered. I couldn't answer, only nodded because my voice was trapped somewhere deep behind the ache in my throat. We went through each box, pulling out photo frames, children's drawings, even Robert's cufflinks he had worn every Sunday to church. Every piece felt like breathing again after being underwater too long. Emily snapped pictures of the labels on the boxes, noting the dates they had been moved here. Evidence, she said softly, but I was too lost in the relief of holding what I thought was gone forever. When we finally dragged the most precious items into the car, I sat in the passenger seat with the album open across my lap. Emily drove carefully, glancing over at me now and then, her expression caught between anger and tenderness. She didn't have to say it. We both knew what Lena had done, and we both knew this moment wasn't about fury, but about reclaiming what was rightfully ours. That evening, David came home from his session with Chris. He looked surprised when he found me and Emily at the dining table, pictures spread out in a patchwork of memory across the wood. He froze his eyes, falling on a photograph of him at 8 years old, missing a front tooth, holding up the fish he had caught with Robert. He stepped closer, picked it up slowly, and sat down without a word. His hand traced the edges of the photo. "I thought these were gone," he murmured. His voice was so quiet I barely heard it. I watched his face soften, the tension in his jaw loosen. He looked at me, then something raw and searching in his eyes. "Thank you for not giving up, Mom." The days after that discovery felt lighter. I spent hours reorganizing the house, restoring the quilt to its spot across the back of the living room couch, hanging the wedding photo in its frame above the mantel where it belonged. Every placement was like stitching the house back together. The walls, once feeling hollow and stolen, began to hum with warmth again. Meanwhile, David seemed to carry himself differently. One Saturday, Chris came by, and the two of them sat in the backyard, sketch pads between them. I watched from the kitchen window as they talked and laughed quietly, pencils moving across paper. It had been years since I had seen David draw, and when I walked out later with lemonade, I saw lines forming into the beginnings of a house design. Chris grinned at me. "He still has it," he said, and David rolled his eyes but didn't hide the smile tugging at his lips. Over the next weeks, Chris encouraged him to think about returning to work, maybe not full-time, but step by step. One evening, David admitted he had been looking at posting small design firms in nearby towns that might give him a chance to start fresh. I listened quietly, letting him talk, because the spark in his voice was more important than any advice I could offer. Emily joined us often, filling the rooms with her laughter, helping me catalog which items had been taken and which were still missing. It became a sort of family project, not just recovering objects, but reclaiming a narrative. The house no longer felt like a battleground. It was becoming a sanctuary again. One night after Chris left, David sat across from me at the table. His sketchbook was open, a rough design spread across the page. He tapped the pencil nervously and said, "I forgot how much I loved this. For so long, I felt like I didn't have the right to want something for myself." I reached across the table, covering his hand with mine. "You've always had that right," I told him softly. He swallowed hard and nodded, the corners of his eyes wet. As spring edged into summer, the air in the house changed. The silence was no longer sharp and heavy, but filled with quiet purpose. The album sat proudly on the coffee table. The quilt lay ready for anyone to curl under, and laughter from the backyard drifted in on warm evenings. For the first time in years, I felt like we weren't just surviving. We were beginning again. The air in the house felt different the morning we decided to bring everything back to its rightful place. I opened the front windows and let the spring breeze carry in the scent of grass and lilacs from the yard. Light poured over the wooden floors, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the house breathe with me. Emily arrived with her arms full of boxes from the storage unit, and David followed close behind, his hands gripping a heavier trunk that had once belonged to my mother. We laid everything out in the living room. Dust rose as lids were pried open, and I stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the sight of what I thought I had lost forever. The wedding album, edges worn, but pages intact, lay at the top. Beneath it was the quilt carefully folded, still carrying the faint scent of cedar from the trunk. My fingers trembled as I reached for them. Emily's eyes filled with tears as she handed me the album. "You should look first, Grandma," she whispered. I sat on the couch and opened to the first page. Robert's face stared back at me, younger than I remembered, smiling wide as we stood together on the church steps. My chest tightened, but not with grief. It was gratitude, fierce and sudden, that these memories had found their way back to me. David knelt beside me and placed a hand on the quilt. "Mom, I'm so sorry I didn't see what was happening sooner." His voice cracked, and for once he didn't try to hide it. I turned to him, placed my palm on his cheek, and shook my head. "You're here now. That's what matters." We spent hours arranging the house again, as if we were stitching its heart back together. The quilt went up on the wall, its colors vivid against the pale paint. Emily dusted the frames before setting the photographs on the mantel. Chris dropped by with fresh flowers and filled the vase that had stood empty for months. Each piece, once stripped away, returned to its place, and the house seemed to sigh in relief. When we finally pushed the dining table back to the center of the room, I ran my hand across its smooth oak surface. I remembered family dinners where Robert carved the turkey, where David leaned his head against my arm after long days at school where laughter filled every corner. That table had seen joy, sorrow, and everything in between. Now it stood ready to hold us together again. That evening we gathered around it for the first meal in years that felt like family. Emily lit the candles, Chris brought out the casserole he had insisted on making, and David poured glasses of water, his hands steady. The meal wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. We ate slowly, talking over one another, laughter breaking through like sunlight after rain. I watched David carefully. The shadows that had lingered around him seemed to lift. He spoke of the sketches he had been working on, the designs he had once abandoned because he thought no one cared. Chris leaned forward, listening intently, encouraging him to share more. It was the first time I had seen my son animated about the future rather than burdened by the past. After dinner, we moved to the living room where the quilt glowed in the soft lamplight. Emily curled up with the photo album, pointing at pictures and asking me to tell the stories behind them. I told her about Robert's terrible dancing at the wedding, about the way David refused to wear shoes on his first day of school, about the Thanksgiving when the oven broke and we ended up eating sandwiches instead of turkey. Each story filled the room with warmth, each laugh settling into the walls like mortar. Later, when the house quieted and only the crackle of the fire remained, David sat beside me. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and for a long time he didn't speak. Finally, he said softly, Mom, I need to tell you something. I was blind. I let someone twist everything I believed about myself about you. I almost lost both. I reached for his hand and squeezed it. You didn't lose me, David. I was here waiting, and you found your way back. His eyes brimmed, but he didn't look away. Instead, he nodded, and in that nod I saw the boy he once was, the man he could still become. Chris joined us, then pulling a notebook from his bag. He handed it to David. I thought you might want this, he said. Inside were blank pages waiting. David laughed softly, shaking his head, but I could see the spark in his eyes. The night carried on, gently filled with the sound of pencils scratching across paper, Emily humming as she flipped through photographs, and the crackle of firewood shifting in the hearth. I leaned back, letting it all wash over me. For the first time in years, I felt at peace in my own home. As the candles burned low, I rose and walked to the mantel. Robert's photograph caught the last flicker of flame, and his eyes seemed to meet mine. I whispered so softly only I could hear. We're whole again. The house was not just walls and furniture. It was memory, love, and justice bound together. Every object returned was proof that truth had prevailed, that resilience mattered, that no one could erase the life we had built. Looking around at the faces I loved, I knew the journey had been worth every tear, every fight, every sleepless night. There are some things you cannot let go no matter how hard others try to take them. And so I tell you this, protect your home, protect your heart, and protect the memories that make you who you are. Because justice, though slow, always finds its way back.